After more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned that poverty has a look. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it hides behind clean clothes worn too many times. Sometimes it hides behind polite manners and quiet answers. And sometimes it stands in front of you with empty pockets, no support, and nowhere else to turn. That was the lesson I was reminded of one morning when a person walked into my courtroom carrying nothing but fear and dignity, trying desperately not to lose either. That morning began like so many others. I woke up early, before the house stirred, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of strong black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just quiet. Those early moments help me prepare for the day ahead, even when I don't yet know what kind of weight will be brought into my courtroom. By 8:15, I was walking through the courthouse doors, nodding to familiar faces, listening to the echo of footsteps in the hallway. The building was waking up slowly. Papers shuffled, voices murmured, doors opened and closed. The courthouse has a rhythm, and after all these years I know it well. In my chambers, Christina had already prepared the files. She knows my routine: neat stacks, notes ready, coffee waiting. We've worked together long enough that words aren't always necessary. I scan the docket. Traffic matters, missed appearances, small violations. Nothing on paper that suggested anything extraordinary. And I've learned never to trust paper alone. Paper doesn't show hunger. It doesn't show isolation. It doesn't show what it takes for someone with nothing to still show up. When I took my seat on the bench and looked out at my courtroom, I did what I always do. I looked at faces, not charges. People sit differently when they're afraid. They hold papers tightly. They avoid eye contact. They brace themselves. The morning moved along steadily, case after case. Some people frustrated, some apologetic, some barely listening. I listened. I asked questions. I ruled. Then Christina called the next name, and the moment I looked up, I noticed something immediately. A person stood slowly from the bench, not hurried, not defiant, careful. Their clothes were clean but worn. Their shoes were scuffed, not neglected, just old. They held a folded piece of paper in their hand like it was the only thing keeping them steady. As they walked toward the podium, I noticed they walked alone. No friend, no family, no one rising beside them. That detail matters more than people realize. When they reached the podium, they stood very straight, like posture was the last thing they could still control. Their hands rested on the edge, not out of confidence, but grounding. I asked them to state their name. Their voice was quiet but respectful. They spoke carefully, as if every word mattered. I explained why they were there: a minor matter, a fine involved, nothing severe on paper. But as I spoke, I watched their face. Their jaw tightened slightly, their eyes lowered. I could see calculation happening behind their eyes, not about guilt, but about survival. I asked if they understood the charge. They nodded. I asked if they wanted to explain what happened. They took a breath before speaking. A slow breath. Then they said something that stopped me from continuing any further. They said they had no money. They didn't say it dramatically. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't plead. They simply stated it, the way someone states a fact they've already accepted. They said they had no job at the moment, no family nearby, no one to help. They said coming to court that day had already cost them more than they could afford. I listened without interrupting. I've learned that when someone admits something like that, they're not just talking about money. They're talking about vulnerability. They told me they hadn't eaten that morning, not because they forgot, because they didn't have anything. They told me they had walked to the courthouse because transportation costs money. They told me they were embarrassed standing there saying these things, but they didn't know what else to do. The room felt different now. I've seen anger in my courtroom. I've seen entitlement. What stood before me that morning was none of that. It was humility mixed with fear, and that combination deserves respect. I asked them gently if they had anyone supporting them right now, Anyone at all. They shook their heads slowly. They said they were on their own. That sentence carries a lot of weight. I removed my glasses and set them on the bench. I do that when I want someone to know I'm speaking to them as a person, not just as a judge. I leaned forward slightly and asked them how long things had been this hard. They paused before answering, then said longer than they wanted to admit. I thought about how often people equate poverty with irresponsibility, how rarely they consider circumstance, illness, job loss, one bad break followed by another. Standing there with nothing doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means life did. I hadn't ruled yet. I hadn't even addressed the fine. But I already knew something important. This case wasn't about money. It was about dignity, isolation, and what happens when someone has nowhere else to go. And that's where this story truly began. As they stood there in front of me, I could see how carefully they were holding themselves together. This wasn't someone trying to avoid responsibility. This was someone calculating every movement, every word, every breath, because when you have nothing, mistakes feel expensive. I asked them to take their time. I slowed my voice, because panic travels faster than reason. They nodded, grateful for the pause, and rested their hands more firmly on the podium. That podium wasn't just wood and metal in that moment, it was support. I asked them how long they had been without work. They hesitated, then answered honestly. Months. Longer than they expected. One job ended suddenly. Then another opportunity fell through. Rent became impossible. Friends drifted away. Family wasn't an option. They didn't explain it bitterly. They explained it like someone who had already replayed the story 100 times in their head. I listened carefully. I didn't interrupt. I didn't glance at the clock. When someone is finally telling the truth about their situation, the least you can do is stay present. They told me they had tried to stay invisible. They said they avoided asking for help because they didn't want to be a burden. They said coming to court felt like a failure, like proof that they couldn't even manage the smallest parts of life anymore. That word stayed with me. Burden. I've learned that poverty does something cruel to people. It doesn't just empty wallets. It convinces people they're worth less, that they're in the way, that their presence needs to be justified. I asked them where they had slept the night before. They lowered their eyes and answered quietly. A temporary place, not permanent, not guaranteed. Just somewhere they could rest for now. The courtroom stayed silent. No shifting, no murmuring. Everyone was listening, whether they meant to or not. I thought about how many people walk into court with lawyers, family members, support systems, and how different it feels to stand alone with nothing but your own voice. That kind of isolation takes courage most people never have to summon. I asked them if they understood why the court required certain fines. They nodded. I asked if they were refusing to pay. They shook their head quickly and said no. They said they wanted to do the right thing. They just didn't know how. That mattered. I leaned back slightly and looked down at the file again. On paper, the solution was simple. A fine, a deadline, case closed. But justice isn't about doing what's simple. It's about doing what's right. I told them something calmly. I told them that the court is not here to punish people for being poor. I told them that responsibility means different things when resources are limited. And I told them that honesty matters. I could see their shoulders drop just a little. That small release told me how tightly they had been holding themselves. I asked them one more question. I asked them what they needed most right now. They looked surprised by that question. Most people in authority don't ask it. They paused, then said they needed time. Time to get back on their feet. Time to find work. Time to breathe without fear. That answer wasn't unreasonable. It was human. I told them that the law allows discretion for a reason. It allows judges to recognize reality when reality doesn't fit neatly into rules. I told them that I was not going to add pressure to a situation that was already heavy. I dismissed the fine. For a moment, they didn't react. Not disbelief. Shock, like their mind hadn't prepared for that possibility at all. When it landed, their eyes filled with tears they hadn't expected. They looked down quickly, embarrassed by the emotion. I stopped them gently. I told them they didn't need to apologize. I told them that dignity includes allowing yourself to feel relief when relief arrives. They whispered thank you, but their voice caught. I didn't let that moment rush past. I told them that this ruling didn't mean they were invisible. It meant they were seen. I also told them something important. I told them that accepting help when you need it does not erase your worth. It preserves it. And I told them that being alone does not mean being forgotten. I asked them if they had access to any services, shelters, employment offices, assistance programs. They shook their head and said they didn't know where to start. That's when I realized this case still wasn't finished. Justice doesn't end at dismissal. Sometimes justice means pointing someone towards stability instead of pushing them back into chaos. I asked Christina quietly to step forward. I asked her to provide information about local resources, employment assistance, temporary housing, food support, not as charity, as connection. I watched as Christina handed them a small list of contacts. It wasn't much on paper, but it was something. And when you have nothing, something matters. They held that paper carefully, like it was fragile, like it mattered. I told them to take it one step at a time. I told them not to be ashamed of needing help. And I told them that coming to court that day took courage, even if it didn't feel like it. They nodded again and stepped away from the podium slowly. As they walked back to their seat, I noticed something subtle. Their posture had changed. They were still tired, still alone, still uncertain, but they weren't folded inward anymore. As Christina called the next case, I sat back and reflected. These are the moments that remind me why discretion exists, why the law cannot be applied without humanity. Poverty is loud on paper but quiet in person. It hides behind manners, behind apologies, behind silence. And when someone finally admits they have nothing, the worst thing you can do is treat them like they deserve less. I watched as they sat down alone again, clutching that small piece of paper. I wondered where they would go next. I wondered how many doors they would have to knock on. I wondered how many times they had already been told no. But I also wondered something else. I wondered what it feels like to walk out of a courtroom lighter than you walked in when you expected the opposite. As court continued, I found myself more aware of isolation, who sat alone, who avoided eye contact, who looked like they were carrying more than they said. Once you notice it, it's everywhere. That day, as the docket moved forward, I realized something important. Kindness doesn't fix poverty, but it can interrupt despair. And sometimes that interruption is the difference between giving up and trying one more day. I knew this story wasn't finished yet, because when someone leaves court with nothing but a small sense of dignity restored, the real story begins after they walk out the door. After they stepped away from the podium, I noticed something that happens rarely, but always leaves an impression. The courtroom stayed quiet for a moment longer than necessary. Christina didn't rush to call the next case. No one shuffled papers. No one coughed or whispered. It was as if everyone needed a second to process what they had just witnessed. I sat there, hands resting on the bench, thinking about how alone that person had looked standing there. Not just physically alone, but socially isolated. When someone comes to court with no one sitting beside them, no lawyer, no family, no friend, it tells a story before a word is spoken. Christina eventually called the next case and court moved on, but my attention lingered. I found myself glancing toward the bench where they were sitting. They held the paper Christina had given them with both hands, reading it slowly, carefully, like it mattered. That piece of paper wasn't a solution, but it was a direction. And when you're lost, direction matters. As the morning went on, I listened to explanations that felt different now. People talked about missed payments, missed deadlines, small mistakes. But after hearing someone say they had no money and no support, Everything else felt louder by comparison. Not because those other struggles weren't real, but because desperation has a way of sharpening perspective. During a short break, Christina leaned over and told me quietly that the person had asked if they could stay and watch the rest of the session. That caught my attention. Most people want to leave court as quickly as possible. Wanting to stay meant something had shifted. I nodded and told her that was fine. I looked out and saw them sitting up straighter than before, listening carefully, observing. Fear had turned into focus. That change told me more than words ever could. Watching court gave them something they didn't expect. It gave them a sense of inclusion. They weren't just someone in trouble anymore. They were a person participating, learning, belonging, even if only for a short time. As I heard other cases, I became more aware of how many people apologized for things they didn't need to apologize for being late, for being nervous, for being confused. Poverty and isolation teach people to apologize for existing. That realization stayed with me. When court recessed for lunch, I returned to my chambers and sat quietly. I didn't turn on the television. I rarely do on days like that. I thought about how many people fall through the cracks, not because they don't care, but because they're exhausted. Because asking for help feels like one more failure piled on top of everything else. I thought about how often society treats poverty like a moral issue instead of a circumstance, and how damaging that assumption can be. When court resumed in the afternoon, I noticed the person was still there. They hadn't left during lunch. They sat quietly, watching, absorbing. I wondered where they would go when the day ended. That thought stayed with me as I listened to the next few cases. Near the end of the session, I saw them stand hesitantly and approach Christina again. They spoke softly, clearly not wanting to interrupt. Christina listened and nodded, then leaned toward me and asked if I would mind if they said something briefly. I nodded. They walked back to the podium slowly. Their posture was different now, still tired, still uncertain, but steadier. They apologized for interrupting and said they just wanted to say thank you properly. They said they hadn't expected to be treated with patience. They said they had expected judgment. They told me something that stayed with me. They said they had spent weeks feeling invisible, like the world had moved on without them. Standing in court that day, they said, was the first time in a long while they felt acknowledged instead of dismissed. I listened quietly. I didn't rush them. I didn't interrupt. When someone is finally being seen, the least you can do is let them finish. I told them something honestly. I told them that being poor does not make a person less deserving of respect. I told them that being alone does not make their voice smaller. And I told them that asking for help does not erase dignity. Their eyes filled with tears again, but this time they didn't rush to hide them. That told me something had changed. Before they left the podium, I told them one more thing. I told them that rebuilding doesn't happen all at once. It happens one step at a time, one phone call, one application, one conversation. I told them not to measure progress by speed, but by effort. They nodded slowly, taking it in. As they walked back to their seat, I watched their steps, still careful, still uncertain, but not as heavy. Something had lifted, even if just a little. Court ended shortly after that. As people began to file out, I noticed them lingering near the back, waiting until the room cleared. When most people were gone, they approached the bench again, stopping at a respectful distance. They said they didn't know where they would sleep that night, but they felt less afraid than they had that morning. They said that knowing someone had listened made the day feel manageable. I told them something quietly. I told them that they mattered, that even when life strips away support, worth remains. And I told them that the resources they were given were a starting point, not a judgment. They thanked me again and turned to leave. As they walked toward the exit, I noticed something important. They weren't hunched over anymore. After everyone had left, I sat alone in the courtroom for a moment. I do that sometimes when a day stays with me. I thought about how many people come to court already defeated, already ashamed, already convinced they deserve whatever happens to them. I thought about how dangerous that belief is. On my drive home that evening, I turned off the radio and let the quiet fill the car. I replayed the day in my mind, the honesty, the isolation, the relief. I thought about how small the legal issue had been and how large the human issue was. At home, my wife asked me how my day had been. I told her about the person with no money and no support. I told her about the fear in their voice and the way it softened when they were treated with respect. She listened carefully and then said something that stayed with me. She said sometimes people don't need to be fixed. They need to be believed. She was right. That night, as I went to sleep, I wondered what doors that person would knock on the next day. I wondered who would answer. I wondered how many times they would be told no before they heard yes. But I also wondered something else. I wondered how it feels to walk out of a courtroom empty-handed, yet carrying something new, a sense of dignity. And I knew this story still wasn't finished. Because kindness doesn't always change circumstances immediately, but it can change how someone faces them. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about that person more often than I expected. Not because of the ruling, but because of the way they stood there, alone, honest, trying not to disappear in front of people who had far more than they did. Those moments tend to linger, especially when they remind you how thin the line is between stability and collapse. A few mornings later, as I was reviewing the docket in my chambers, Christina mentioned something casually that made me look up. She said the person from that case had called the clerk's office, not to argue, not to complain, just to ask a question. They wanted to know if the dismissal meant they wouldn't owe anything later. They wanted to be sure they hadn't misunderstood. That detail mattered to me. When someone has nothing, uncertainty feels dangerous. One unexpected letter in the mail can feel like a threat. I told Christina to call them back and assure them everything was resolved, nothing owed, nothing pending. When she nodded and left, I sat back and thought about how rarely people consider the emotional cost of uncertainty, especially for someone already living on the edge. That same morning in court, another case came before me that echoed the same theme in a quieter way. A man stood before me who had a job, a car, and family support. He complained loudly about a fine, arguing it was unfair. I listened, but I couldn't help thinking about the person from days earlier who had nothing and still spoke with humility. Perspective has a way of sharpening judgment. As court moved on, I noticed something else. People were sitting alone more often than I had realized. No support beside them, no one waiting in the hallway. Once you start noticing isolation, you see it everywhere. Later that week, I saw them again. I was walking back from a brief recess when I noticed someone sitting on a bench near the hallway outside the courtroom. They were holding the same folded paper Christina had given them days earlier, reading it again. Slowly, carefully, like they were memorizing it. When they noticed me, they stood up quickly, almost too quickly, like they were afraid of being in the way. I immediately told them to stay seated. I asked how they were doing. They said they were tired, but they were okay. They said they had spent the last 2 days making phone calls, employment offices, shelters, assistance programs. Some calls went unanswered, some led nowhere, but they said they were trying. Trying matters. They told me they had slept in a different place each night since court. None of it permanent, none of it certain, but they said having that list of resources made it feel less hopeless. They said it felt like a map when everything else felt unfamiliar. I listened carefully. I didn't rush them. I didn't offer false reassurance. I've learned that honesty builds more trust than optimism. I told them that rebuilding is exhausting, even when you have help. Doing it alone takes a kind of strength people rarely acknowledge. I told them that setbacks don't mean failure. They mean the process is real. They nodded slowly. Their eyes looked tired but focused. That focus told me they hadn't given up. They asked me a question that surprised me. They asked if coming to court would always feel that intimidating. They said they had avoided situations like that for years because they were afraid of being judged. I told them something honestly. I told them court doesn't have to feel like punishment. It should feel like resolution. And I told them that their experience that day was how it's supposed to feel, even if it doesn't always happen that way. They seemed relieved to hear that. Before they left, I asked them if they had eaten that day. They hesitated, then shook their head. I felt a tightening in my chest. Hunger is not something people should have to admit in a courtroom. I asked Christina quietly to step in again. I asked her to provide information about a nearby food pantry that I knew was reliable. Not because it was my job, but because it was the right thing to do. They accepted the information carefully, almost reverently. When you've had to stretch everything, even kindness feels fragile. As they walked away, I noticed something subtle but important. They didn't rush, they didn't shrink. They walked steadily, even if the path ahead was uncertain. That evening at home, I told my wife about seeing them in the hallway. I told her about the calls they were making, the places they were sleeping, the way they were still trying to move forward. She listened quietly and then said something that stayed with me. She said poverty doesn't just take resources, it takes safety. And when safety disappears, everything feels harder. She was right. The following week, I heard another small update through Christina. The person had managed to get a temporary bed at a shelter, nothing permanent, just a few nights. But it was something. They had also scheduled an appointment with an employment counselor. Small steps, fragile steps, but forward. But I thought about how easy it is for people with support to dismiss those steps as insignificant. When you have nothing, those steps are everything. In court that day, I found myself more aware of how I spoke to people who were clearly struggling. I slowed my pace. I explained things more clearly. I reminded people they weren't stupid for being confused. I saw relief in their faces. Compassion has a ripple effect. A few days later, another note arrived at the clerk's window. It was from them again, short, handwritten. They wrote that they had their first interview scheduled. They wrote that they were nervous but hopeful. They wrote that being treated with respect in court had made them believe they could still be taken seriously. I read that note twice. People underestimate how much confidence comes from being treated like you matter. When someone has been dismissed enough times, respect feels revolutionary. I place the note in my desk drawer where I keep reminders. Not reminders of success, but reminders of why tone matters, why patience matters, why discretion exists. As weeks passed, I didn't see them again, and that was okay. Court is not a destination, it's a passage. If someone doesn't return, it often means they're moving forward. But I thought about them often. I wondered how the interview went. I wondered where they were sleeping now. I wondered who, if anyone, had shown them kindness since. And I realized something important. When someone has no money and no support, kindness isn't just comforting, it's stabilizing. It gives them enough footing to take the next step. I didn't know how their story would end, but I knew how it had changed. They walked into my courtroom with nothing but fear and dignity. They walked out with dignity intact and a reason to keep going. And I knew this story still had more to tell, because sometimes the most important part of a story happens quietly, long after the courtroom empties. As more time passed, the person stayed in my thoughts in a quiet, persistent way. Not because I was worried, but because their situation represented something larger than a single case. They were the kind of person the system often forgets, not intentionally, but through momentum. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. One morning, about 2 weeks after I last saw them, Christina mentioned that someone had stopped by the clerk's window early, before court even began. She said they didn't want to interrupt, they just wanted to drop off a note. When she handed it to me, I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was careful, slightly uneven, written slowly. They wrote that they wanted to let me know they had attended the job interview. They didn't know yet if anything would come of it, but they wanted me to know they showed up. That line mattered more than the outcome. More. They wrote that showing up felt different now, less frightening, less like walking into judgment. They wrote that the courtroom experience had changed how they carried themselves into intimidating spaces. I sat with that note for a long moment before folding it and placing it in my drawer. These notes are not part of the record. They're part of the responsibility. Later that day, court was busy. The docket was full. People came and went. But I found myself noticing small details more than usual. Who was counting change at the podium? Who hesitated before speaking? Who apologized before being asked a question? Poverty teaches people to apologize for existing. That realization stayed with me as a woman stood before me, visibly anxious, clutching a purse that looked heavier than it should have been. Her case was unrelated, but her fear felt familiar. I spoke gently. I slowed things down. I saw her shoulders relax, and I thought again about the person with no support and how kindness spreads when it's practiced consistently. A few days later, I received another update through Christina. The person had been offered temporary work, not full-time, not permanent, but honest work, a few days a week, enough to begin rebuilding something resembling stability. Temporary doesn't sound like much to someone with options, but when you have none, temporary is a lifeline. They had also been able to stay at the shelter a bit longer while they figured out next steps. Nothing guaranteed, but for the first time in a while, they knew where they would sleep at night. I found myself quietly relieved. That same week I saw them again, unexpectedly. I was walking through the hallway after court when I noticed them standing near a bulletin board, reading a flyer carefully. They looked thinner than before, still tired, but their posture was different. They noticed me and smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one, but it was real. They told me they had started the temporary job, cleaning work early mornings, hard on the body, but honest. They said it felt good to earn something again, even if it wasn't much. They said something else that stayed with me. They said the hardest part of having nothing wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was feeling like no one expected anything from you anymore, like you didn't matter enough to be counted. They said coming to court and being treated with respect reminded them they were still accountable, still part of the world, still someone whose actions mattered. That insight struck me deeply. Accountability is often misunderstood. People think it's about punishment, but for someone who feels invisible, accountability can feel like recognition, like being seen as someone worth holding to a standard. I told them that responsibility and compassion are not opposites. They work together. I told them that showing up, working, trying again, all counted, even if the progress felt slow. They nodded. Their eyes were tired but steady. Before they left, they told me they had one goal, just one. They wanted a room of their own, somewhere safe, somewhere they could close a door. That goal felt modest, but it carried so much meaning. As they walked away, I thought about how often people measure success in extremes, big houses, big careers, big wins. But for someone with nothing, a door you can close is everything. That evening at home, I told my wife about seeing them again. I told her about the job, the shelter, the goal of a room. She listened quietly and then said something that settled deep in me. She said when people lose everything, they don't need miracles. They need consistency. She was right. Over the next few weeks, I heard occasional updates, not directly, just small mentions. The job continued. The hours increased slightly. They were tired but showing up, always showing up. One morning, Christina handed me another note, shorter this time, the handwriting steadier. They wrote that they had been offered a small room in a shared apartment, nothing fancy, just a bed, a door, a lock. They wrote that they would be moving in the following week. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. This was not a dramatic turnaround, no sudden success, no overnight transformation, just stability slowly taking shape. They wrote that they wanted me to know because the day in court was the first day they didn't feel like they were falling anymore. They wrote that being treated with kindness gave them the courage to keep asking, even after hearing no. I placed that note in my drawer with the others. As court continued that day, I noticed how differently I spoke to people who were struggling. Not softer in a way that suggested pity, clearer, more deliberate. I wanted people to understand that they were expected to try, but also allowed to be human. One man stood before me, angry and defensive. Instead of matching his tone, I asked him what was really going on. He paused, then admitted he was afraid of losing his job. That admission changed everything. Compassion does that. It opens doors people didn't know they could walk through. I realized something important. The person with no money and no support didn't just change their own situation. They changed how I listened. They changed how I noticed. And that change would ripple outward to countless others. Weeks later, I didn't hear any more updates. And that was okay. That usually means someone is busy living. But one afternoon, long after court had ended, Christina brought me one last note. This one was simple, just a few lines. They wrote that they were settled in their room, that they were still working, still tired, still cautious, but safe. They wrote that they wanted me to know that kindness had changed everything, not because it fixed their life, but because it gave them a reason to believe they could. I folded the note carefully. That person walked into my courtroom with no money and no support. They walked out with dignity intact. And from there, step by step, they rebuilt a life. I knew then that this story was nearing its end, not because the struggle was over, but because the foundation was set. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed something subtle but important. I stopped waiting for updates, yet the lessons from that case continued to show up every day in my courtroom. That's how you know a moment mattered. It doesn't announce itself again. It simply changes how you see. One morning, as I walked into the courthouse, I noticed a man sitting on the steps outside, counting coins carefully before standing up. I noticed an older woman adjusting the strap of a worn bag on her shoulder before entering. I noticed how many people hesitate at the doors, like crossing that threshold cost something. I had seen those things before, but now I really saw them. In my chambers, Christina mentioned that I'd been pausing more often during hearings. She said it gently, with a smile. I smiled back and told her that people sometimes need a moment to catch up to their courage. She understood exactly what I meant. That day in court, several people stood before me who were clearly struggling. One man had lost his job and was behind on everything. A young woman was working 2 jobs and still falling short. Each case was different, but the fear underneath was the same. Fear of being judged, fear of being dismissed, fear of being reduced to a number. I slowed down. I listened. I asked questions that weren't just procedural. I watched how people responded when they realized they weren't being rushed out of the room. Shoulders dropped, voices steadied. Truth came out more clearly. I thought again about the person who had come to court with no money and no support. How carefully they had chosen their words. How afraid they had been of saying the wrong thing. And how different everything became once they realized they were being heard. Later that afternoon, Christina brought me a message that made me pause. The person had stopped by the clerk's office again. Not to ask for anything, not to explain anything, just to say hello. They hadn't wanted to interrupt court. They had come during a quiet moment and left a short note. Christina handed it to me with a knowing look. The note was simple. They wrote that they were still working, still adjusting, still learning how to live with a little stability after so much uncertainty. They wrote that some days were harder than others, but they weren't afraid the way they used to be. They wrote something that stayed with me deeply. They said that when you've had nothing for a long time, even stability feels unfamiliar, like you're waiting for it to disappear. But being treated with kindness helped them believe that maybe it wouldn't. I folded the note and sat quietly for a moment. That waiting for the other shoe to drop feeling is something many people carry long after circumstances improve. Poverty leaves echoes. Kindness helps quiet them. That evening, as I drove home, I thought about how many people mistake judgment for accountability. They think being harsh teaches responsibility. But I've learned that respect teaches responsibility far better. When people feel valued, they want to rise to it. At home, my wife noticed I was thoughtful again. She asked what was on my mind. I told her about the note. I told her how that person was still rebuilding, still cautious, still trying. She nodded and said something I won't forget. She said, when someone has lived without safety, safety doesn't feel natural. It feels temporary. It takes time to trust it. She was right. In the following weeks, I saw the effects of that lesson play out again and again. People came into court expecting confrontation and left surprised by calm. I didn't lower expectations. I clarified them. I didn't excuse behavior. I contextualized it. One morning, a young man stood before me who was clearly frustrated. He spoke sharply, almost defensively. Instead of responding to the tone, I asked him what was going on in his life. He paused, then admitted he was living in his car. That admission changed everything. I handled his case appropriately, but I also made sure he left knowing he wasn't invisible. I saw the same relief I had seen months earlier in someone else's eyes. That's when it really sank in. The person with no money and no support didn't just change their own outcome. They changed how I listened, how I paused, how I recognized fear when it showed up disguised as anger or silence. I realized that many people come to court already defeated, already ashamed, already convinced they deserve whatever happens to them. When authority reinforces that belief, it does damage that lasts far beyond the ruling. But when authority interrupts that belief, something else becomes possible. One afternoon, as court ended, I walked slowly through the empty courtroom. I do that sometimes when a case stays with me. The benches were empty. The podium stood still. I imagined all the people who had stood there, carrying quiet desperation. I thought about how easy it is for systems to overlook individuals, not because people don't care, but because they're busy. Efficiency becomes the goal. Speed replaces attention, and in that rush, people get lost. That person almost got lost. They didn't ask for special treatment. They didn't ask for money. They asked for understanding, and understanding created momentum. I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where I keep notes like theirs, letters, short messages, handwritten reminders. They don't celebrate victories. They remind me of responsibility. They remind me that words spoken in moments of vulnerability stay with people for years. I thought about how the law is often described as blind, but I've learned that justice works best when it sees clearly, when it sees circumstances, when it sees effort, when it sees humanity. As the days went on, I stopped receiving notes from them, and that was a good sign. It meant they were busy, working, living, adjusting. Court was no longer a central part of their story, but they remained a central part of mine. Every time I see someone standing alone at the podium now, I notice it. Every time someone says they don't know where to turn, I remember how heavy that admission is. And every time someone apologizes for being poor, confused, or afraid, I stop them. I tell them they don't need to apologize for existing. I've learned that kindness doesn't fix systems overnight, but it can stabilize a person long enough for them to find their footing. And when that happens, change becomes possible. I knew then that this story was almost complete, not because the struggle ended, but because the meaning had settled. The final chapter wasn't going to be about what I did. It was going to be about what kindness made possible. The final part of this story didn't arrive with a dramatic moment or a public acknowledgement. It arrived quietly, the way real change usually does. It arrived through absence. Through the simple fact that I stopped hearing updates, stopped seeing notes, stopped wondering if they had eaten or where they had slept. Silence in this case was a good sign. It meant they were busy living. One afternoon, months after that first day, I was sitting in my chambers after court had ended. The building was quieter than usual. I had removed my robe and folded it carefully, the same way I always do. That ritual helps me separate the cases from the day, the stories from myself. Christina knocked gently and stepped inside. She handed me an envelope and said it had been left at the clerk's window earlier. No return address, just my name written carefully on the front. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I sat down before opening it. Some things deserve that pause. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was steadier than before, still careful, but confident in a way it hadn't been earlier. That detail mattered more than the words themselves. They wrote that they didn't know if it was appropriate to write again, but they wanted to share one last update. They wrote that they were still working, still tired most days, still careful with money, but stable. They wrote that they had been promoted from temporary work to something more regular, not glamorous, not easy, but consistent. They wrote that they still lived simply but safely. They wrote that they could close a door at night now. That door mattered. They said something else that stopped me completely. They wrote that the day they came to court was the day they stopped seeing themselves as a problem. They wrote that before that moment, everything felt like proof that they didn't belong anywhere. After that moment, they began to believe they had a place again. I read that sentence twice. They wrote that kindness didn't solve their problems, but it changed how they faced them. They wrote that being treated with dignity reminded them they were capable of rebuilding, even if it took time. At the end of the letter, they wrote something simple. They wrote, "I'm okay now, and I wanted you to know that mattered." I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the drawer where I keep the others. I didn't feel pride. I felt something quieter, gratitude. Gratitude for being in a position where a small moment could mean so much to someone who had so little. I sat there for a long time afterward thinking about how easily that day could have gone another way. A rushed ruling, a fine imposed without thought, a reminder that they already knew they couldn't meet. Any of that could have sent them back into despair. Instead, discretion had opened a door. I thought about how many people come to court already defeated, already ashamed, already convinced they're a burden. I thought about how dangerous that belief is, and how easily authority can reinforce it without meaning to. That person didn't need a lecture. They didn't need punishment. They needed to be seen. As I walked out of my chambers that evening, I passed through the empty courtroom. The benches were silent. The podium stood still. I imagined all the people who had stood there over the years, each one carrying a story no one else fully knew. I've learned that justice isn't only about outcomes. It's about experience. It's about how people feel when they leave. Do they leave smaller or steadier? Do they leave ashamed or capable? That person left steadier. The next morning, as I took my seat on the bench, I carried that lesson with me. A young man stood before me who was clearly nervous. He spoke softly. He avoided eye contact. Instead of rushing him, I slowed down. I asked questions carefully. I watched him relax. A woman stood next, apologizing repeatedly for being confused. I told her she didn't need to apologize for learning. I watched relief cross her face. These moments happen every day. They don't make headlines. They don't go viral, but they matter. I realized something important over the years, and this case reminded me of it again. Authority is not just power, it's responsibility. the responsibility to recognize when someone is at their limit, the responsibility to apply the law with wisdom, not indifference. That person with no money and no support taught me something I will carry for the rest of my time on this bench. They taught me that dignity is not a reward for success. It's a starting point. People don't rise because they're punished into it. They rise when someone believes they can. I thought about my own father often after that case. He came to this country with nothing but determination and hope. He used to tell me that respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. Standing on this bench, I've seen how true that is. That person wasn't asking for special treatment. They were asking not to be crushed by circumstance. They were asking for a chance to stand back up, and once they had that chance, they took it. I don't know what their life will look like years from now. Judges rarely do. But I know this. They walked into my courtroom with no money, no support, and no sense of belonging. They walked out with dignity intact. From there, step by step, they rebuilt. That is not a miracle. That is what happens when kindness interrupts despair long enough for effort to take hold. As I continue my work, I carry that awareness with me. Every time someone says they have nothing, every time someone stands alone, every time someone looks like they're bracing for judgment, I remember how powerful it is to say, "I see you." After more than 40 years on this bench, I still believe something simple. Justice should never make people feel disposable. It should remind them they matter. That day in court didn't change the law. It changed a life, and it changed how I listen. I'm Frank Caprio. I've spent my career believing that the law works best when it remembers the human being standing in front of it. And when someone comes to court with nothing, the least we can do is make sure they leave with their dignity. Thank you for listening to this story.